Hello, my name's Tony Michaelides. You're listening to Awaken Nation with Brad Zollis and me.
A huge shift is taking place on planet Earth. People seem to be waking up. Tired of the way things used to be, they are creating something brand new and changing the world we live in. My name is Brad Zollis, and I get to sit down with the next generation of idea makers, the disruptors, and the game changers. Everyday people, just like you and me, from all over, who are doing amazing things. Welcome to Awakened Nation.
Hey, everybody. I have Tony Michaelides on today. And if you don't know who he is, you're in for a real treat. We're going to be talking about David Bowie, Peter Gabriel, U2. I mean, all your favorite bands from the 70s and 80s. This guy's the real deal. And as you know, we do a deep dive into the extraordinary. And I've listened to your work before, Tony. You've got some great stories, my friend.
Well, thank you, sir. Yeah, it's funny, actually, because I've said this a few times, so for fear of repeating myself, I don't think it's till the roller coaster ends, Brad, that you really have the time to sit back and enjoy it and appreciate it for what it was, you know, because you're so wrapped up in it. Like I always say to people, you put so many hours in. I was probably on like $3 an hour, you know, the amount of time I spent. And then now it's kind of, the good thing about it is the plus is, and here in the case for the defense, is when you get older, like I say to people, I'm a much smarter version of myself than I was 15 years ago. what I'm doing now is I'm kind of rebranding myself into kind of a bit of a rock and roll storyteller, you know, because I have a kind of lessons learned from rock and roll brand and a partner in California where we're going to be doing kind of training things and stuff. And I think because, you know, the stories involve famous people tend to listen to them differently, you know. Because a lot of people who run in corporate America grew up with a lot of the artists that I worked with, you know.
Yeah. I let me read your bio real quick, because you're like the background of greatness here. You know, we sit here and we look at the forefront of all these bands that we loved and listened to, and you're the engine behind all this to get them out into the forefront. So buckle up, ladies and gentlemen. This is an exciting episode. Tony Michaelides has an irrefutable reputation achieved over 30 years, working with a stellar cast of clients that include David Bowie, U2, REM, Genesis, Dave Matthews, Bob Marley, Depeche Mode, Matchbox 20, The Police, New Order, The Stone Roses, Peter Gabriel, just to name a few.
Never heard of them.
Never heard of any of them, right? Tony founded and ran one of the most successful promotions companies in the United Kingdom for over 20 years. In 2004, he moved to the United States of America after being granted an alien of extraordinary ability for services to the music and arts. A published author, Tony speaks, mentors, and inspires audiences all over the world based on his own insights collection, the book he wrote on the lessons learned from rock and roll. He also hosts his own weekly podcast, Moments That Rock, and it's excellent, by the way. Everybody's got to tune in and listen. And in addition, presents 2 other radio shows. Tony's new book, published by This Day in Music Books, is also called Moments That Rock. Please welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Michaelides.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Brad.
Yeah, anytime. And before we get started, I really have to throw this out and thank my good friend, Rob Anspach. Rob and I, you know, we're like that 21st century relationship. Rob is from my hometown. We've had dozens of Zoom meetings and phone calls and done business together, and yet we haven't met in person. Welcome to the 21st century.
Well, at least we have Zoom. Do you remember Skype? I can't remember the time I mentioned Skype. Zoom's kind of taken over.
Well, I was one of the first people on Skype. And there was also something called Hoodoo, I think, or something before that. I'm probably getting the name wrong, which was, you know, the cousin to all this, the redheaded stepchild of all this stuff. So it's amazing to me because I grew up on the Jetsons cartoon, and they said, you know, in the future, you're going to have a robot in the house and you're going to have a video telephone and all this. And here we are. We're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, technology is good for a lot of those things. Like, for instance, something like this, you couldn't afford to do things like this because when phone calls were like £1 a minute, Can you imagine what video would have been? It's like, I've done the interview. It's just cost me $250.
I know. It's crazy how things have changed.
Oh, yeah.
So let's get started. I've done my research, and I got to tell you, the thing I love about your story is I hear this from a lot of other people. They kind of tripped into the business that they're in, and then they just went after extraordinary success. And your story is no different. You really were trying to avoid a 9-to-5 job when you fell into the music industry. Let's start there at the beginning of your story.
Yeah, well, I went to school like everybody else, and I mean, Bruce Springsteen summed it up. I learned more from a 3-minute record than I ever learned at school. That's kind of a bit rude, I suppose. But the thing is, it was kind of, when I left school, they had a thing in the UK called further education, which was perfect for people like me who were kind of done with school, but not quite ready for work. Doesn't mean I wasn't ambitious. It just means I didn't know what I wanted to do. But like I say a million times, I needed some money to buy records and go to gigs. So I got a job, but it was a crap job. Nothing about it inspired me. From the moment I got in to the moment I left, it was like every time you're looking at your watch. And I'm not that type of person. I like to integrate with people, and build relationships and learn from other people and stuff. And that just wasn't happening. And then one day I was going home and I picked a copy up of the local newspaper where I lived, Manchester, the Evening News. And the only time I usually got it was just to find out what gigs were happening, or maybe the odd record review and stuff. And I happened to look at the classifieds and talk about fate, and so I'm flicking through that and I saw a job for a sales representative, which was like £25 a week. This is 1974, and that's probably about 35, 40 bucks, And I thought about it, and then, well, I keep saying that I didn't think about it, but that was rubbish. I couldn't stop thinking about it, to the extent the following morning I took a trip down to the HMV store in Manchester, and I flicked through the section of transatlantic records, which was folk and jazz. And I was growing up listening to, like, I had hair then, and I was growing up listening to like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and the Pink Floyd. So it wasn't a genre of music I knew anything about. But, in a way, I suppose I'm quite proud, in as much as I had the bottle to, that might be a bit of an English colloquialism, a bit of the guts to apply for it. But the thinking was, I didn't have a job in the music business. So if I didn't get it, I still didn't have a job in the music business. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And I did apply for it, and I didn't get it. It was the usual standard letter, which is like, thank you for your such and such. Unfortunately, the position has been filled. We will keep your letter at hand. Well, that's like thank you and good night, except the fact that I did keep my record in hand, my letter in hand. And 6 months later, I got approached by a guy. It was really funny because the guy that they employed was a bit of a space cadet. I mean, we were just coming out of the 60s, really. And this guy kind of got warned twice for arriving at work stoned, So, and then he lost his job because he fell off a mountain. What I like to say is he was probably too stoned to even know he'd lost his job. So I got approached, and I'd already got the gig, really, because the guy came up to see me, who gave me my first job, almost became a mentor. And when I came to the States, I brought him in. Well, I didn't bring him in. I introduced him to a guy that was running this tech company, and he was the ex-president of Virgin, But I started doing that, which is just retail, just going to the stores and supplying them with. I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but I got to learn that people like I Love Supreme by Miles Davis, was a classic jazz album.
Right.
And, Wayne Shorter and people like that. And there was a lot of folk. Folk was big in the north of England and Yorkshire. So I had a lot of stock that would sell regionally really well. But it was fantastic in those days, Brad, because you had the opportunity to, I mean, apart from getting paid for doing a job, I was getting turned on to amazing music, but because the people behind the counters were real music fans,
Yeah.
And they would say, oh, you should listen to this and you should listen to this. So all of a sudden my record collection was like stuff I wouldn't have discovered without, the people. So I built up really good relationships. And then in 1976, I moved to Anchor Records, which was the English subsidiary of ABC. So then I was selling a country with people like Don Williams, but I also had like Steely Dan, and Poco and, a broad cross section of stuff. But it was a sales job. It was van sales. So you could get people to take new releases and try to, see if they'd shift and sell. And if not, you'd swap them over for records that did sell. So it was a great opportunity for kind of emerging artists, And then, like, in 1978, it's quite bizarre because a friend of mine, a girl I knew, her roommate worked for Island Records. And Island Records was my all-time favorite record label. I was buying their records in the 60s. And she was doing displays because she was putting really, fancy displays in front, store windows and stuff. And so she had a job at Island. And I was kind of finding a way not to do it because I was thinking, like, this is the idiot in me, I was thinking, like, well, I don't really want to go and laugh at DJ's jokes to get my records played. I don't want to be a sycophant. And of course, it wasn't that at all. And like I said, this was my all-time favorite record label. So I went to see the guy, and I was just smitten. I walked into, like, the building, and there was, in those days, I mean, you had a girl on reception who looked like she could have been on a Roxy Music sleeve and stuff.
Right.
And it's funny because when I arrived, there was nobody in the office, and I thought, well, have they gone out of business? And they were all out playing football. And then at like 2:00, they all came in, like these blokes with like dirty knees and like sweaty shirts. And these are my former colleagues,
Right.
Again, I'd already got the job. It was just a case of turning up. It wasn't really, I had to, you didn't sit down and say, what do you think you could offer this company or anything like that?
Yeah.
A proper interview. But it was, it was the 70s, and it was like, it was a cool vibe. So I took that job, and I suppose an easy way to sum it up, Brad, is to say that best move I ever made, because I was working with artists whose records I'd bought as a kid. Like I was buying Traffic records in the 60s and working with Steve Winwood. And, and the same thing happened with people like Bowie later on down the line. So, I mean, that I keep saying that, and like now, to be an old fella, to appreciate the fact that just doesn't happen to a kid from the north of England,
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up like a lot of my friends at school. I wanted to play for Manchester United, but guess what? I didn't. I wanted to be a rock star. I got a bass. I was a lousy bass player. So all of a sudden, like, I kind of stumbled into it.
Yeah.
I would never say it was luck, because I had all of my friends who went to the same gigs and bought the same records, and I'm not putting them down for getting proper jobs, but they all had the opportunity to pick up the same newspaper as I did. But I did, and I applied for it, and my job became an extension of my hobby. So that's it in a nutshell, without droning on endlessly about lots of fabulous bands.
Yes. But it's powerful to hear this, because my audience loves a deep dive into the extraordinary. And hearing you showed up and you were responsible, as opposed to that guy who fell off a mountain. You had what it took, at least the basics. Today, if you had started, you'd wind up in some sort of marketing gig, I'm sure.
Well, the interesting thing was at school, they don't teach you communication skills. I mean, I did stuff like Latin, which was really handy, I mean, not that I ever got a chance to, speak Latin to anybody or anything. And you do, I chose the arts. So I did like French and German, and,
Right.
English language was my favorite subject. I wasn't into the sciences like, physics and chemistry and stuff and things like that. But, I've said this when I was promoting my book to people. I was saying the interesting thing was when I was kind of, 6 or 7 at school, I realized that I didn't want to hang out with this guy who was a bully. And when I was in my teens and discovering girls, I would have to stand in front of them. There was no swiping left and right, to find it. So I learned my communication skills on the street, having no idea that I was going to work in an industry where communication skills were vital. Because the whole essence of the job is building relationships. I mean, to be honest, it is in any job. The more you get, on with people, the more they listen to what you say. And I always say people didn't play my records because they liked me. They listened to them because they respected me. They knew I had a job to do. And my job was to act as the conduit between the label and the radio station, and then the managers and the artists and all the people that were, and obviously the band. So it proved really, really, really good for me, because and again, it's only kind of come to light probably in the last 10 years. I've been in America 20 years, but the reason I moved here, Brad, was the music industry was kind of falling apart around me, and I hadn't done anything wrong. But I had all the things that went with running a company, like overhead.
Right.
like, the £1,500 a month rent, and then company cars to drive artists around to radio stations. And then in those days, you were kind of leasing like fax machines and photocopiers. They were like $100 a quarter, £100 a quarter. I mean, these things you can get for like $30 at Best Buy. It was a major cost. So when I was like probably 10 grand a month, my overhead, well, it was never going to be like that. And again, I kind of, they call it like entrepreneurial, I mean, what's more entrepreneurial than emigrating? I call it like flying by the seat of my pants, because I've never woken up having a clue what's going to happen any one day. And I kind of love that. I wouldn't want to go in and have like where I finished yesterday to pick up and, get on with the next day's work and stuff. But I did a lot of things my own way. For instance, when I emigrated, instead of sitting there and wondering what I was going to do, I was turning 50. You can't really go to the job centre and what they're going to find you. Well, we've got, there's not really anything that they could do for you. So I kind of, was very naive. I had a place in Orlando, to be fair, so I had somewhere to live. But I just thought, well, they like the English accent. I might do a Ford commercial or something. I might do a radio show. And then, you put yourself around. But it was kind of like, in a way, what kind of rubs off on you that you don't really understand at the time is like, that's what David Bowie did at the peak of his career, if you like. He killed off Ziggy Stardust, put it to bed, and then moved on with the next part of his career, not worrying about, he couldn't make it work type thing. So like now, I kind of, and I'm at the age now where I feel like I have a duty to put something back to help keep the memory alive of some of the greatest artists that ever lived, I don't want to get too nerdy about it, Brad, but, Bowie won't exist again. It's a fact, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with me. It's everything to do with him. And people should know that. But it's not just the songs and stuff like that. It's the whole package. The humility, the graciousness, all those things that rub off on you. And that's why I find that I learned so much in a job that, wasn't really educational, but it was the best education I ever had.
I agree with you. And they just did a study recently where they found out that the most successful people in any area of work or employment, they found that soft skills were the real separator between those people who may have had great skills but couldn't communicate, couldn't talk, couldn't do any of these things. But I want to go back to the 70s for our audience because, 70s was a big deal for me. And as I got older, I started to, one of my favorite bands from England is The Who. So I started going back. I got I think it was their 50th anniversary album they put together, the compilation. And I started to realize those older first hits sounded so much like the Beatles, in the 60s. But as we transitioned into the 70s, these rock stars found their own groove, their own voice, and really started to experiment and explore and do very powerful stuff. And I remember this distinctly, Tony. You're going to laugh. I think I don't know what age I was, but my cousin April, she pulls me into her bedroom when we're really, really little. I think I might have been 10. And she goes, come, you got to listen to this. And she puts on her record player, Ziggy Stardust. And I was like, I don't know what I'm listening to, but I like it. And I heard this rumor, maybe you can confirm it, but David Bowie was deathly shy of performing. And he would literally create a persona, a character, so he could go out on stage to perform. And you knew Bowie quite well. So let's talk a little bit about that, because he is not just a fascinating character, but he is a masterwork of the rock industry, I feel.
Yeah, David Bowie is the reason a lot of people you talk about glam rock and people don't really think of that, but him and Mark Bolan at the time probably invented it, that kind of thing in the early 70s. It was flamboyant, but I want to make one thing clear. I didn't work with David Bowie in that period. I was a fan back then. I was selling records. But I have a good story about that, because when I went to college, further education college, it was 70% girls and 30% guys. So I became social secretary, which was the guys that was booking the bands.
Right.
So, you know, I had all the tickets for all the gigs. So it wasn't hard getting a date. And I dated this girl, and I'd just bought Ziggy Stardust. And I went to pick her up. And, you know, back in those days, their mother would throw you in the living room while she was upstairs getting ready. You know, like the nerd I was, I'd rifled through the record collection. I picked up Hunky Dory, and I'm thinking, oh my God, the girl I'm dating for the first time has got the album before the one I've just bought. So naturally, I married her and had 2 kids with her. I mean, what else would you do?
I think you figured it out early, huh?
Getting back to the story, I was a fan. I learned a lot more about, because my entire life was pretty much, you know, going to gigs socially. I mean, so it's music, you know. My social life was to go and get a new album, take it round to my friend's house, and we'd listen to it together. So you were turning each other onto music and things. And then, like that, as a fan, that came along. And then the 80s and stuff, when I started working, it was when I physically worked with him, was in the 90s, around the Earth.
Oh, wow.
Because I got approached by his management stroke publicity company in London. They couldn't cover the tour. And that was another funny moment, because they phoned me up and said, we're not able to do this. Would you go out on the road as David Bowie's publicist? And there's like a pause, you know, because it's like, am I hearing this right? You know? And then
wait, could you repeat that?
Exactly. And then the funny thing at the end of it, she said, yeah, we'd really like to do it. She said, David likes to meet everybody he's working with. So could you go to I think it was the Manchester show the next day? And, you know, I'll give you the name of the tour manager and introduce you. And that's quite right. You know, if I was him, I'd want to work with people I was working with. So I got the royal seal of approval. But it's really funny, because at the end of the conversation, I can like hear it now as I'm talking to you. And the girl says to me, she said, okay. She said, well, go and meet, you know, David and the tour manager and everything, and we'll talk about money later. So again, there's this pregnant pause. I'm saying, you want me to go out on the road and work with David Bowie? And she went, yes. I said, and you're going to pay me? Like I needed paying to go and work on a David Bowie tour.
Right.
It's like a knighthood, for God's sake.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, that was like unbelievable, really. And another, listen, you're going to bring out the hopeless romantic in me, so I'm making no excuses for this. One of my jobs on that tour, the Earthling tour, was to throw the photographers out the pit, you know, because back in the early days, all the great photographs, like Henrik's lighting his guitar on fire and stuff like that, photographers were roaming around the stage. You know, that photograph of Mick Ronson, Bowie with Mick Ronson, like biting his guitar, like fellatio, you know,
yeah,
scene almost, you know, but great pictures for the moment. Like nowadays, you're only allowed the first 3 numbers. Well, bands are warming up in the first 3 numbers. So all those classic iconic shots were all taken from back in the days. So my job was to, after the first 3 numbers, to move like the Japanese photographers, the English photographers, all out the pit. You know, right, that's it. You got to go, guys, you got to go. So then there's me in the orchestra pit with all the crowd behind him. He's only playing like a small 1,000-seaters. So that was like a night out, you know. It wasn't like you're stuck in a field, like watching it on screens. Yeah. And every night, I might burst into tears here. Every night, Bowie would walk out in like a white satin shirt, white silk trousers, barefoot, with an acoustic guitar and a white spotlight on him, looking like David Bowie, you know, which,
yeah.
If it's Elvis Presley and David Bowie for an image, it begins and ends there, doesn't it?
It does.
Play on and I'm here, right, about as far away, well, not as far literally away from you, and I'm there looking at him, and he would come out with an acoustic guitar with a white spotlight on him and play something like 5 years or an acoustic version of either Ziggy Stardust or Hunky Dory. If you could have told me that 30 odd years ago, that would be me. I mean, it's almost like it's better than meeting the Pope.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that had a real, not in kind of a starstruck way, but in a, I don't believe this is happening kind of way.
Right.
And being a grown up, did I really say grown up? At the time, it was like, it was, you know, and I found myself going from gig to gig, listening to David Bowie's music. He wasn't asking me to listen to it or anything. It just had that infectious feel. I mean, I remember going to a friend's record store on the way to a gig in the Midlands, which is the middle of the UK. And I called in, and Bowie was into like a drum bass period, like that. So I picked up, went into the store and I picked up like half a dozen CDs. I said to my friend behind the counter, I said, can you sort me some drum and bass stuff? I said, I know nothing about it, but, I'd like to give them to Bowie. So when I arrived at the gig, he's coming off the bus, and getting into the, going into the theatre. And I just went up to him. I said, oh, David, you're probably sick of this. Like, got these, I got you these. He said, oh, thank you so much, Tony. Well, the night of the gig, he's coming on, he's walking on stage with the band, and the lights are down. And he walks over to me and he just looks at me like this. He says, thank you so much, Tony. I've only had a chance to listen to a couple, but they're really good. I mean, this is a guy who could walk into any record store in the world with a pile of CDs up to the counter with his credit card saying, no, take them, you're David Bowie. To have the graciousness to come over and say thank you, I mean, it seems really simple, but it's not. It's huge.
It's a big deal. I agree with you.
And another thing, just while I'm at it on the David Bowie bit, is at the time, David Bowie had artists like the Pixies and Nine Inch Nails as his support band, not for the money that people would buy to get on a tour with a major artist, but just because he liked them, right? So not only did they get to play support songs, they were actually probably more relevant at that time in their careers than he was, because he had periods of more success than less, because he was experimental in his music. He tried different things because as an artist, he wanted to satisfy himself. And it's quite incredible because every night he would be at the side of the stage watching the Pixies set. Instead of chilling out backstage like most bands do, at the side of the stage watching Nine Inch Nails and the Pixies. Could you imagine being in that band, knowing David Bowie was watching your set? I mean, again, it's like royal seal of approval. I mean, I know it sounds like starstruck, but it's not. It's more a case of emphasizing what an amazing human being he was.
Yeah.
And still is.
There's certain people, I always laugh at myself because I think, what if, we sit there and we pick out the great musical icons starting way back in the 1600s and things like that. Who's going to be the icon we remember in the history books 100 years from now? And to me, David Bowie is number one, because it wasn't that he had a hit over here or dozens of hits. It was the fact that he brought music. He ascended music to a different level of performance, of art, of experimentation. And I think it's hard nowadays to find that. I was very worried about this new generation. My nephew, I helped raise my nephew Sebastian, and I was just like, are they going to have any real rock stars? And then he turned me on to Linkin Park. And I was just like, okay, all right, this is a new genre, but the intensity and the love, the passion, you could hear it in every voice, every word, every scream. And I saw it in Pearl Jam as well, and Living Colour, another great band I like. And so I think we are now in this day and age where they have niche marketing, and I'm sorry to sidetrack a little bit here, but the record companies, you talk about reinvention and pivoting. The record companies, I think, started to realize, instead of going out and having everybody loving this artist, let's find that niche that just loves the heck out of them. Taylor Swift comes to mind. Sorry, folks. But, they'd rather sell an album to millions of her fans than try to hit 300,000 in sales. And so that shift has taken place, and you seem to have gone with the flow of that. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I came here was, when Napster came along and everything, like I said, I'm turning 50, and, nothing lasts forever. If you're a footballer and your knees go, you're never going to play at that level. So I was kind of almost smart, dare I say, enough to think, well, time to reinvent myself. And when you think of so Bowie had subliminally had an effect on me by doing that, by taking like a chance,
Yeah.
But going back to what you were saying about him, like, you got to remember when Ziggy Stardust came out, David Bowie had been around for 10 years and he had one hit with Space Oddity. Now, who, after having, he was behind on his rent in London and stuff, when he went on the road. And then he had main man management. And that's another story, because he ended up owing a lot of money, because all the money that we were spending then, he didn't realize it was recoupable,
Right.
Ended up in court as per usual with a lot of things, sad. But what I'm saying is, when you have 10 years of almost anonymity, apart from like one hit, I mean, like Macarena had one hit, but it wasn't David Bowie. It was just like one massive novelty record. Space Oddity was around the kind of trips to the moon and all that, so it was relevant and things, but it was a big hit. So once you get explode into the market, so to speak, who kills that off when you've waited that long for success? I mean, he wasn't like 16, 17, he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when you look at it, he also became that alter ego. He became a heroin addict. But where we lost Brian Jones and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison and Jimi Hendrix, all the 27 Brigade, we'd have lost Bowie if he wasn't smart enough to kill off the thing that would have killed him, drug addiction.
Yeah.
That in itself is like, wow, what a move that was. Because it was, everybody was doing, stuff like that in the 70s, and to the detriment of the fact that they're no longer here. We lost a lot of great artists, but they couldn't keep it together on a, normal level.
It is sad that we lost the greats, and it was to their addictions. And it's such a testament to see that Bowie stood up and said, I can't do this. Today we have all this rehab programs and we have all this help, but back then you either had discipline or you didn't.
And you also had, don't forget, when you get like all the names we mentioned, I mean, they were household names, everybody had one of those, or probably more than one of those records. But the thing is, everything is in front of you when you reach rock star status. You can have everything, literally, from sex, drugs, and rock and roll to beyond. You go to a restaurant, there's no tables, they find you one.
Right.
You go into like a club, they give you the VIP room, they bring you a bottle of champagne. So it's easy to just click your fingers and everybody comes running type thing. But you've got to. I mean, what I love more than anything, like I say, David Bowie would have been fine without me, because he was a genius right through his career. But the fact of the matter is that, I didn't break David Bowie, but with a band like U2 getting involved from day one, getting them their first radio session outside of Ireland, their first national session, their first TV, and learning my trade as they were learning theirs, was incredibly rewarding. Because my greatest thrill, if you like, going back in, my career, was artist development, was nurturing and developing talent. And the other thing is, you have this, you talked about like, it was different. So one of the big things that was different, Brad, was the fact that they invested in talent. We live in an age of instant gratification. You two, and I say this 1,000 times, you two, took me a year and a half to get them on the radio. You were getting like, taking them to tiny little radio stations in the middle of nowhere to get, 2-3 tracks from the album Boy and an interview with Bon on the Edge going out at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, small stuff, picking up whatever you could and then driving 3 hours to your next interview. And they were persistent in working hard. It's called paying your dues. I mean, in any job, you should rise through the ranks. And I work with Simon Cowell as well. That instant gratification where you kind of, I mean, the American Idol model was a stroke of genius from a marketing point of view. I mean, when you think of it, you get a bunch of nobodies who were queuing up for days in a car park to get an audition. And then you put them on national TV. They're even getting money for the telephone calls. And then at the end of it, each week they'll talk about, record amount of votes and calls and this and that. And then they go through to the final and you have the new American Idol and the winner. And you put out a record that everybody has told you they already like it. So you don't have to think if it's going to go to number one. It's a foregone conclusion. So as a marketing point of view, it was brilliant. But the other thing is, Simon's the first to admit it, in as much as he's, to quote himself, he said, if you ask me, I'd rather be if I'd rather be the 5-star Michelin chef or the McDonald's guy, I'd rather be the McDonald's guy every time, because he was driven by making money. I don't mind that because he admits it, but he wouldn't, I don't think he's bothered about putting his name to something that you can be proud of,
Right.
I mean, I really enjoy doing stuff like this, where I can be gracious and thankful that I had the opportunity to learn from masters of their trade. Not like I wanted to be a musician or anything like that, but I have a course that I'm going to put out, like an ebook kind of thing, lessons learned from rock and roll. So you talk about, like, when you work with an artist like Bowie, you understand what dealing with fame's like, where the others got lost on the wayside. But look at U2. When they were teenagers, they decided to share all the publishing when they prepared him for the school disco. I mean, I come from Manchester. That's what split up bands like the Smiths and the Stone Roses, because when the money comes in, don't start complaining then. You need to get your house in order. So it's a great lesson in preparing for success. And then you look at U2 with Live Aid, where everybody got 15 minutes, and Bono did his walkabout, pulled a girl out from the crowd, started slow dancing, but the band can't even see where the singer is. And then the plug gets pulled. That's it, guys, next band. And Pride, we just got on the radio. And everybody was devastated. I mean, the manager went off to Southern Ireland, furious. The band nearly sacked him. Paul McGuinness, Bono went to Southern Ireland in disgrace. And it was like in the moment thing, But then Paul McGuinness went off to Ireland to stay with a friend, really annoyed about his lead singer. He went out in the morning, he bought a copy of La Parisienne, and on the front cover, it was like Freddie Mercury and Queen, and U2 stole the show. And that was an audience of 1.4 billion people. And that took about a mistake turning into an opportunity. Yeah. I mean, that was the pivotal moment in their career, because people bought into that moment of him just, swaying on the front of the stage instead of playing, what was their forthcoming hit single.
Yeah. What was your magic formula? I mean, you produced all these bands, but you had your own PR company. What was your secret sauce, if I may ask?
Well, the interesting thing about the PR company was it sounds arrogant to kind of explain how it worked, but when I was working for Island Records, after 2 years, they had to lay us off. So I got a job with Charisma. That's when I worked with Genesis and Peter Gabriel. But after that, there wasn't too much left on the catalogue. So I was phoned Island Records back. There were 5 owners that got laid off. And I persuaded them, because I'd seen U2, I'd persuaded him to give me my old job. I said I'd do 5 people's jobs for one person's wage, which was kind of tempting. So then I got offered a job at A&M, and we were talking around Police being the biggest band in the world. And I didn't want to leave. I was fiercely loyal to a label that had already laid me off once. I didn't want to leave Ireland. So I went down to see the guy, and he said, well, why don't you set up independently? Come and work for us and them. So that was like, entrepreneurial, innovative management, whatever you want to call it, But the thing is, I had no experience in business or anything like that, but I had experience in life, if you like, in as much as, I developed good relationship with friends and stuff and things like that. And when I set up my own company, the guy said to me, when are you moving to London? And I said, I'm not moving to London. He said, you'll have to move to London. I said, I don't have to do anything. I mean, it sounds really arrogant, but I said to him, regional promotion, why would I travel 200 miles south to travel 400 miles north to do my job? But when I employed people, Brad, I went back to my moment at rock, my first moment at rock, which was getting my sales job, selling records out the back of a van. And I was like working 200 miles from the nerve center. So I could have ducked and dived and not worked full on. But I went out every single day to prove to that guy that it was the best decision ever made, giving me a job. So I would work like hell. I'd go into record shops, I'd get to know the people. We shared similar tastes in music, and as well as selling records, they couldn't wait to turn me onto something, things like that. And I think when I decided that I didn't want to go and work in London, I didn't want to pick my family up and live in a bed sit in London and be at gigs every night of the week. I wanted to do normal things, play soccer with friends and stuff. Sorry, football with friends. and then so when I started, the people I employed, I never employed anybody who worked for a record company. I just employed people who I thought had that certain something. And I would give them one piece of advice. I would say, listen, I don't want you to be me. 2 me's would be unbearable. Go out and make it your own. And I give you one piece of advice. Whatever you screw up on, I'll pull you out of. So there was one guy that, he'd never been to London, bless him. So I wasn't going to send him to meetings. So I would get up at 5 a.m, get the 7 o'clock train to London and get the 9 o'clock at night train back so that he could be left to do what he did best and allow him to move through the ranks, so to speak. And, I had a girl phone me up. I had other people leave to start their own promotions companies. I had a guy that was a plugger, we called them in England, who went to team up with a national DJ, and he's still on national radio. And the introduction was through me. And my intern was this girl who phoned me up from Cardiff University. She just graduated. And she said, I'm moving to Manchester and everybody says I should come and work for you. I said, oh, that's very nice, but there's no room at the inn, we're full up. And she said, well, I'm coming to Manchester. Can we at least meet up and have a drink? And I said, yeah, we can do that, So I met her before, and then we went to a gig afterwards. And she said to me, I'll come and work for you for nothing. So I said, well, I can't say no to that. But I'll tell you what, I said, we've got artists, and, we have, we can't send you in a car with an established artist. I can put you in the back seat so you can watch what's happening, but I can't let you out on your own to do it. And I said, but you will be making cups of tea. But guess what? I make cups of tea as well. So that philosophy of I wouldn't let anybody do something that I wouldn't do, And I think the other thing dare I use the word business, but on a business level is you should never be scared to delegate things to people who are better at it than you are. Because I had a guy who was really good at promoting records to radio. And I was kind of growing out of that because I was more into representing the company and being the guy on the letterhead. It was important. Right. I look back on those things, Brad, and it was like whenever we did a promo tour, I would be the first guy to take the artists out. Matchbox 20, I took them to Scotland, we hung out, this and that. So when they go back to London, they know the guy on the note paper. He's not just, well, who is Tony Michaelides, Right. And nobody taught me that. And I look at it now, all these years later, and I think, that's pretty smart, So sometimes I do slap myself on the back.
It's called happy accidents, I call them.
Yeah, happy accident. Yeah, it's good name for a band, actually.
Happy accident, yeah. Do you believe there's a turning point for almost every star where they become a megastar and then they make this weird turn? And just like Bono did, it was a it was a huge mistake to do what he did. Is that common in the rock and roll industry?
Well, I think, you see, the thing is, like with a band like U2, I mean, there's a lot more behind it. I mean, there's ample books on YouTube where, people can find out and, documentaries and all sorts of things because they're an internationally famous band. But the interesting thing is that, and it's not something that I'm disclosed, it's common knowledge, but both Larry and Bono lost their mothers while they were about 13. So Bono, I've heard him say it himself in interviews. It says it wasn't a case of I wanted to be in a band, I had to be in a band. So instead of going to school and being that angry kid, that why have you got a mother and I haven't? The band was his family. Right. So they put 150%. And I look at the things that they did. I mean, for instance, the first time I went to see them, they were third on the bill a Saturday night in Manchester. There was like 300 or 400 people there to see the headline act, but nobody knew who this band was. And most people at the bar talking. So, they're just waiting for the headliners. But after the show, they would come out and meet everybody that wanted to meet them and then get in the van with the tour manager driving, the equipment in the back, and drive in the pouring rain to the next gig to have them meet, get them out of bed. Come on, guys, we've got to be here, and, like I keep saying, paying your dues type thing, But the thing is, could you imagine now with social media, somebody like Bono, even as that young whippersnapper kid, getting into the van and getting on social media? And getting like 5 girl fans in Japan and waking up and getting 200 fans because they've said, hey, I met this guy, this band is really cool. And they become your like PR unit. But there was none of that available to it. It was literally, signing anything, talking to people for as long as they did and then moving on. They would go to the warehouse and meet the people that were pulling the records out of the racks. And they would go to the record stores and they elevate themselves above a catalogue number because, they became real in the eyes of their audience. And I think that resonates with people. I mean, I look now at people like, you got Springsteen on the road, 73 years of age. He's having a ball.
Yeah.
And I honestly believe, Brad, that, when you're in that audience and you see a guy who doesn't need to do this, having a ball and enjoying himself, you buy into that. You just think, this is great. This guy's having a wild time and he's loving it. And he's got Steve Van Zandt coming behind him and pulling his ears while he's singing. And, Patty's not even, because he's got a grandkid now. So the wife's, going back to look after the grandkid and watching the old fella on stage instead of being there. I love it. It's just,
It is. I love stuff like that too, because I have a marketing and design background, and I watched as all this digital marketing took over.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we stopped having catalogs in the mail and mailers and actually meeting in person. And guess what happened, Tony? This is the most phenomenal thing. Now, if you send out a catalog mailer, you get everybody's full attention because there's no other catalogs but yours. Okay? You get a mailer in the mail. So if you go out and meet people, grassroots effort, people, you're going to build this momentum without ever having a social media presence. And all of a sudden, this happened with Dane Cook. Dane Cook, the comedian over here in the United States, nobody knew how he came out of nowhere. Well, here's what he did. When he was young, he's traveling to all these different towns, and he would get everyone's email who liked him in those towns. He would personally email them when he was heading back.
Wow.
So when the bookers were booking him, he'd have a packed house, and people are like, what the heck is going on? This is how he was able to play Madison Square Garden. This is the reason why, and he was young. Okay. Madison Square Garden did like 2 or 3 movies in a row. I mean, the guy was making all this money because he took it personally. He took it right down to brass tacks, old-fashioned marketing. Hey, I'm going to be here. Let's meet face to face. And fans come out in droves. So I think this is going to have a huge comeback now, I believe. I mean, tell me that I'm wrong, but I feel getting out on the road again is what's going to make the difference for every one of these bands.
Well, I agree with you. The only thing is, it's we could spend like hours talking about it, but I mean, when you look at the price that it costs, with Live Nation and people putting on all these additional fees, which is, it's like fees for this and fees for that, and then I mean, I went to see U2's 30th anniversary concert because my wife Mary wanted to go, and it was like $30 to park my car in a field, so I moaned all the way there. And then we had to, One Republic was supporting, and I would like to have seen him, but it started to rain. So we were huddled in the players, entrance. And then U2 came on and, it stopped raining. And I said to somebody, it's like, you're watching it on the side of the stage on screens.
Yeah.
And, and then everybody's up there with their phones going, filming the concert. And I'm watching it on the screens. And then I've got to drive all the way back, get my car in the car park. So I said to somebody, I said, if you could pick me up in a helicopter and drop me off in the field and pick me up and put me at bed afterwards, I'd be fine with it. But, the thought of just going through that, and I'm spoiled, Brad. And I'm not talking about with working in the business. I'm talking about growing up when I did. I saw pretty much everybody who ever meant anything to me, Dylan, Springsteen,
right.
All those bands in under 2,000 seaters. So I could see the sweat on the faces and things. And I was at the gig. I wasn't an occasion. I mean, football grounds weren't made to be concert halls.
Right. It's true.
I mean, the big productions, when you've got like a massive expenditure because you're charging a fortune, you're selling out all over the world. I mean, U2 had an 8K production, which was pretty impressive. And you got to remember that album, Joshua Tree and stuff came out in the 80s. Yeah. So they've been playing those songs for 30 years. So they play them a lot better now.
Yes, I would think. I saw U2 at Yankee Stadium in New York City back during the Zoo TV tour. And there were 35,000 people in the arena. And I just was like, this is incredible. Incredible. And they were using the video, the beta, Max running around with the handheld camera a lot back then. And phenomenal. And I think, and I want to ask you this, because you being in the industry, you started to spot which bands were studio bands and which bands were stadium bands. And you can hear it in, like, Steely Dan, clearly a tight studio jazz-based band. But then you hear bands like Led Zeppelin, today's, Linkin Park, even Grey Days, which was Chester Bennington's first band. These bands demand to play in a stadium. Were you able to hear that right away as you were in this business?
Well, you've actually quoted the classic case study, because I always, kind of part of what, I'm doing on an ongoing basis with, not like using the word teaching, but reciting those stories about, the inner workings of those bands. When I saw you two play to 11 people in a pub in Manchester, 3 days after seeing them at third on the bill. And, right. They didn't come out and were pissed off because nobody was there. They played to 11 people like they were playing to a stadium. And when they play to a stadium now, they play like they're playing to 11 people. They have an ability, because, Bono is the type of frontman that you can't ignore. He makes you pay attention. And that's what a lead singer should do. He should have the audience drawn to their performance. And, you get better and better and better with it. So when you're playing to a massive amount of people, you have to assume that it's intimate. Now, obviously, it's a vast arena. I mean, I've seen it from the side of the stage. If you walk up to the microphone and you're in that band and you look at that, I mean, personally, I think my hands would freeze. I won't be able to play a note. But you really have to draw them in. So, right. The kind of, and Springsteen obviously is a master at it. The storytelling bits in between. I wrote this, and not like just standing there and this one's called, And I think we went through a period. We had a thing in the UK back in the 90s that we had a thing called shoegazer bands, which came after punk, and right. They were kind of well, not really mods and stuff, but they would just play like that, looking at the feet, And it's not right a show, right. You want you want to see the band live. Otherwise, for me, you can watch 1,000,001 things on YouTube that are better than some live performances. But that sounds like me bitching about it. I mean, you mentioned Taylor Swift. She's an incredible entertainer. She gives it her all, and people adore her. But she does have an amazing ability to communicate with them and keep them glued with her, so that they stick with her, they're loyal, and she is grateful for all that. So she doesn't just turn up late or cancel when she wants and things. But she's kind of, I have different ideas of, it's not really being critical about things, but I always say that, you take an artist like Adele and Ed Sheeran, and I always say that Simon Cowell wouldn't sign an artist like that because he wouldn't know what to do with them. Because there's a certain amount of turning acts into something that you can market nowadays, rather than letting that band grow. The biggest bands in history, and that includes the Beatles, even right back then and stuff. Of course, we talk about Led Zeppelin, the Pink Floyd. They built a following from playing live. And you two were slowly building an audience that all of a sudden, when a record came up, it would buy, that the audience would buy it. And that's what would make it chart. So they didn't have to rely on airplay and stuff and things like that. They relied on just blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, it's a really hard job. And the more successful you become, the longer it takes. Your tours are years.
Yeah.
And you spend more time on the road with your workmates when you're in a band than you do with your partner. Because, if you're married, you go off to work, one stays at home or whatever, and do another job, and then you come back and you have a limited amount of time. You're 24/7 when you're on the road.
Yeah. I am a fifth generation drummer in my family, and I started out, my grandfather was kind of semi-famous for being a drummer in the big band era. I went on to play drums, and I didn't choose it as my main profession as I got older. I chose design. And the reason I did is because I was loading my drums back into my house at 3 a.m. And I said, I don't want to do this. And my dad used to laugh, why couldn't you learn the piccolo? Because he had to drive me to those first gigs when I was little. But I did learn very quickly on, when you're dating or you're in love, it gets very boring quickly, because when everybody else is dancing and your significant other is whatever, wanting to dance, you're on stage.
Yeah.
So the glamour really wears off super fast. And I think you learn to spot BS artists who are just in your vicinity because you're famous or because you're working with famous people, and it becomes annoying. I know this firsthand, but let's talk a little bit about that, because you're working with some really, really famous people. And you mentioned this earlier in the interview. They're just so down to earth when you're working with some of them. What was it like? I mean, because like you said, you're from Manchester and all of a sudden you're elevated into the limelight. Did that affect you as well in any way, shape, or form?
No, I don't think it affected me for several reasons. One, I was too busy to be affected. Because, as a band grows and becomes more successful, there's not less work to do, there's more, because everybody wants to talk to them, everybody wants to see them. And so there's not much time between. By the time they finish a tour, they're straight back into the studio, and then the next album's coming out and you're still working on somebody else at the same time. So you have to manage your time well with it and stuff. But it was, sorry, what was the question? Senior moment.
Just basically how, you're starting to work with famous people. Did it affect you? Did you get an ego?
Oh, right.
Did you,
Well, the thing is, it was a privilege to work. I mean, to work with people whose records I bought as a kid is like a fairy tale, to actually be in the presence of those people. You bought the records, you never thought that would have happened. I mean, it's really strange. I live in down by St. Pete Beach in the Tampa Bay area, and just up the road from me is a guy called Henry Smith, and he's a friend, and he's mid-70s now, but he was Jimmy Page's roadie in the Yardbirds, English, and he was Jimmy Page's roadie all through Led Zeppelin. So, needless to say, he's going to be a guest on my show, and he's going to be telling me some Led Zeppelin stories. But the Zeppelin is a great case study. Not that anybody could ever be anything like him. I mean, even to the extent that their manager Peter Grant, who came from being like a wrestling promoter, and was fiercely devoted to the band. If you tried to rip money off them, he'd hang you off a balcony. He wouldn't bother about anything like that, because that you were stealing money out of them. Never had a contract with them.
Wow.
And I interviewed a guy called Richard Cole many years ago. Sadly, he passed away a couple of years ago. He was their tour manager, but he got totally screwed up. He ended up having to go to rehab and everything like that. And he was like Bonzo's mate, so he was doing all the same things as Bonzo. But the point is, with Richard was saying to me, obviously Zeppelin were in the 60s, and he said every day they would never go on stage until they got paid, because there were a lot of dodgy dealings going on. And he would go backstage into the promoter's room, and he'd open the drawer, and the drawer would have a wad of cash and a gun in it. So it's like, get the cash in the briefcase. Okay, guys, off you go.
It's a very different model than today. Holy moly.
Oh, yeah. But those bands, like I say, I mean, I think they set a precedent, because a lot of those people, and Clapton's the same, Page, they'll all tell you the same thing. They were influenced by those Mississippi Delta blues singers, Keith Richards.
Yeah.
And that's why they picked up guitars. And I love that about music, where it gets slung from one slide to that came over, and then you got the Brit sound and stuff, and the rock acts, the Deep Purples and the Led Zeppelin, and that came over, and then you had the air bands here and stuff. So there's always kind of been cycles in music up until recently, because kind of hip hop and rap seems to have been there forever.
Yeah.
Because punk came and went, and there was house music and stuff and things like that, which was, not condoning it anyway, but a lot of periods are drug related, it was like LSD, and, then it became ecstasy and stuff, and people really off their faces just dancing to frenzied crowds, just enjoying the moment, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, music has been the backdrop of our lives. I'm a baby boomer, so all I have to do is mention a song from my graduating class, and all my high school mates are going, "Oh yeah, I remember that." It really is part of our lives.
The great thing about that, Brad, is, and I wouldn't say I avoided talking about it, but I've gone the complete opposite now. Because for a start, after a lifetime of promoting people, I'm doing it pretty well, if I say so myself. You know, I'm not very good at promoting myself. So I have an important vehicle in a way to turn up and share the stories, not for my own benefit, although hopefully people buy my book and listen to my podcast and the result of it and come and see me talk and things like that, because that's my way of putting something back. But like everybody else, I have to pay the rent and put food on the table.
Yeah.
So I might as well do something that I suppose I've graduated from what I did. So to be able to share experiences that other people won't be as fortunate enough to have, not that that's putting me on a pedestal, but just to say, you know, when you say certain things like I told you about you two playing to like, you know, 11 people and things like that. And you mentioned like the effect of music on people. I don't care if you're into football or whatever, you don't remember a great goal or a touchdown. Music takes you back to a time and a place, and invariably with a person. And I've been doing interviews when my book came out, a lot of, you know, telling the stories that are in the book. And I was writing a story about meeting Led Zeppelin when I was 15 and with my friend and going backstage. You know, another moment that rock, that's where Moments That Rock came from. It made me appreciate at 15 years of age what it was like to meet your heroes. Now, all my friends from school went to the same gig and bought the same records, but somehow I got backstage. But when I was writing the thing up, Robert Plant came out and I had a poster and he just leant down and said, "Do you want me to sign it?" And it was like, "Oh, yes, please, sir," you know, like nodding my head, you know. And then he rolled it up, passed it down to me. I was with my friend. And then he looked at me and said, "I don't suppose it's much good with just me. And do you want to come and meet the guys?" And it was like, "Oh, yes, please, sir," you know. Like, so we go backstage. And I tell you, I'm writing this in my book, Brad, and I could see the dressing room. And we're talking about a 1969 gig. And I'm writing this in 2022, right? And I remember in those days, there was no hospitality. There was the big mirror with the light bulbs. It was like a theatre, you know. And Jimmy Page is sat with his hands underneath his thighs, rocking his legs on the desk, on the countertop. And Robert Plant is in the other side of the room. And he leans across to him. He says, "Are you going to come round to our house tomorrow? And then we'll finish that song." And I'm like one finger typing, like on the computer. And I'm going, "Oh my God, could I have been there at a moment in history? You know, could he have been talking about Stairway to Heaven or something?"
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, like, yes, it sounds nerdy, but the other thing is, it was a moment that rocked, that had an effect on me. Even writing about it 50 years later, it still resonated with me. And, you know, like I say, I don't care what music you like, as long as, you know, there's something. And I think the thing is now with what I want to do for the rest of my life, you know, I'll do it. They can wheel me out and, you know, I mean, I'll still be talking when the commissioner will come in at the end of the night and say, "Listen, they've all gone home now. Can you turn the lights off?" And I'll still be there telling stories. But the thing is, I do think that, you know, there's a place, you know, there's always an audience. Because the other thing is, the lessons learned from rock and roll, and like with my partner, you know, the ingredients of greatness and deconstructing magic and things like that, you make these people real because of what they do and what they achieve and how they go about it. And I think that, you know, that in the same way with artists, how many people would pick up a guitar after hearing Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix and stuff? How many people would want to get in lead a band after seeing David Bowie? That effect. Well, you know, if I had the opportunity to grow up in my world with greatness around me, then, you know, to share those ingredients of greatness with people and let them know what I saw, like literally with my backstage pass, is important. Because here's another quick story is, you know, why do they call Bruce Springsteen the boss? He's had the same staff for 50 years. The only two who've left have died. So tell me, Mr. Game Developer, like the new rock star, how come you leave your job every 2 years to double your salary? Do you not think these guys can get a job anywhere? It's a great lesson in staff retention. So all those lessons learned from rock and roll can enter into the corporate world. And like I always say, like the music industry is unique. There are no two bands alike, no two managers alike, no two labels alike. But the thing is that, you know, how it works and those ingredients of greatness and things stand out. And then the next thing you have to do is be able to sustain it, because there's only one way to go when you reach the top, and you can crash down as much as quick as you go up. But, you know, a lot of the people we've been talking about, their legacies are left in place, and that's a good thing.
Tony Michaelides, ladies and gentlemen.
Your battery's run out.
What's that?
I hold the world record for people's batteries running out.
Tony, pick up his book, Moments That Rock. Also, tune into his podcast, Moments That Rock. Tony Michaelides, I want to thank you for being on Awakened Nation. I am going to ask you 3 questions in our lightning round.
Sorry to be rude, bud. Can I just say
No, go ahead.
About my podcast?
Sure.
I interviewed, like last week, I interviewed a guy called Tim Clark, who was the managing director, which is the equivalent of the president of Island Records when I started there in 1978. And I'm on the other side of the mic doing what you're doing here, just listening. Yeah. And my whole philosophy behind my podcast was the premise being, if I like hearing these stories, why wouldn't other people like hearing them? And it's really flattering in a way, because when you're working with people and you're helping them make money, it's very easy for people to take your calls. But when you're no use to whatsoever, you could get the PA going, "Oh, tell him I'm not in," type thing. But to be able to reach out to a bunch of people that I grew up professionally with and having them share their stories, rock their world, again, is my little way of sharing what I learned with people from the people I learned from as well. Because, mentors are a really special thing as well. And I was fortunate enough to have those around me. So sorry, I had to put that in.
No, that's important. I love your stories, man. I really do. And here's the thing that's rare. You not only tell the story, you bring back some of the lessons that you learned and what was so great about that person. And that, I feel, is the most important part of storytelling.
Yeah. And I think we live in an age of storytellers as well, and I think everybody has a story. And I think, like I say, you find the audience for your story. And, I think in a certain way, there are advantages of getting older, sir.
Yes, it is. We slow down and we listen more. At least I hope I do. My girlfriend says I don't. The whole premise of Awakened Nation was I have accumulated a lot of friends who are now quite famous, have HBO specials and everything. And also, wow. I was in business, and I was in comedy, and I was in entertainment, and I also did these big corporate meetings. So I've met some of the most famous people in business, comedy, entertainment. So I sat there one day and I just said, the first couple of seasons, I just called up my friends, and people are like, "How do you get famous guests?" I'm like, "Well, because I helped write their whole act when they were nobody, or I was there when they bombed miserably, and now they're playing to sold out stadiums." My friend Gina Brion, I used to help her go on the road and get paid for comedy. Now she has HBO specials. I have a friend of mine, another comedian, business people. I know a lot of very famous business people, and they just happen to be friends while we were on the way up.
Yeah.
And so I just call them up and say, "Hey, I really want to get your story now because it's super interesting." And I feel like you and I are kindred spirits in that way, simply because it's like, I love people. I'm a people person.
Same with me, but it's not like work, is it? It's just like up and thinking, I think I've got something you might like, and until I'm proved otherwise. And same with you. It's kind of like you are sitting there in your private, and we do have our own private moments where you just gaze out the window and think, wow, that was quite a ride. And, I think, going back to the age that we grew up in, where we didn't have social media which is a huge void, where you had to stand in front of people and build relationships. And like now, I laugh at myself in a way, because, I'm just reading the other week, the Edge turned 61, because he was 18, I think, when I met him. But you forget everyone else is getting older as well.
Yeah. It is a funny road that we've traveled. And I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, 40 was considered old. You're like, what am I going to do when I hit 40? Now I'm 60 and I'm like, okay, what else can I do? That's how it goes.
When I was at school, the careers officers didn't come to school and teach you how to get a job in the music industry. They taught you how to get proper jobs, insurance, banking, attorney, stuff like that. So my career guidance was just like flying by the seat of my pants.
Yeah. Isn't it funny? They don't teach success principles. You have to figure it out on your own. And they're like, good luck. And that's it. Off you go.
so much of it is so obvious, Brad. I mean, for instance, I always say you don't learn to drive a car until you pass your test. It's not until you're out on the road. And I came through a generation of people that made it up as we went along. There were no music schools. And I missed out on nothing because I don't subscribe to that. I was working on a think tank when I first came here and interviewing people who'd rewritten the Publishing Act by walking into Elton John's publishing company, walking away with 30 million and him and all his stuff. And schools have got some guy who's read like 3 books on publishing and who's teaching it.
Right.
It teach me anything.
It's crazy. Well, there's a great statement or quote that I love, and it goes like this. When you're in school, you study for the lesson, then you take the test. In life, you take the test, then you learn the lesson.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I like that. I'm stealing that.
So here's our lightning round. I'm going to ask you 3 questions real quick. Sure. And out of all the talent you've worked with through the years, what was your favorite memory with your favorite artist?
I would probably always put Bowie ahead of everything else, because of the story that it means to me. I mean, I didn't grow up listening to U2. I kind of discovered them because they were thrust in front of me. Here's a band we've just signed type thing, although I did see them just before they were signed. So I suppose like Bowie is always going to be the answer to a lot of questions like that. I worked a lot longer with U2, many years, as they were growing and things. And I think that's incredibly satisfying because I'm a great believer in from small acorns, So that was incredibly rewarding. But the other thing is, and one thing, if I've got time to just mention it, because you mentioned Peter Gabriel at the beginning, and I think Rob mentioned it as well, and I immediately interrupted and I said, it's really funny because when I was growing up, like I said, when I had hair and I was growing it, I was into that, what we call progressive rock. So it was Led Zeppelin, the Pink Floyd, and a lot of, smaller bands, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath and stuff and things. That was what was happening, and stuff. But also, your music tastes evolve as you get older as well. So I was missing out on, it was like 10 years later and I was finding out, well, Wilson Pickett and Sam and Dave and Otis Redding, and I just missed them because I was into rock,
Yeah.
But the weird thing about it was like, I was never into that English art school stuff. ELP, Nice, Genesis. And Peter Gabriel left Genesis in the 70s, and started off his own career. But, Peter Gabriel, for me growing up, I'm talking about in my teen years, was like this funny bloke had this flower pot on his head singing in this arty band, because they're all public school boys and all that. So lots of arty, And I wasn't a fan of that music. So when I worked Peter Gabriel 3, and I was obligated to go and see him because it was my job. So I had to go and, get some media interest and take people along and stuff. And I picked up the album and Games Without Frontiers. And it was like Hans plays with Lottie, Lottie plays with Jane, Jane plays with Willie, Willie is happy again. Oh, that sounds like that bloke, from that with a flower pot on his head. And it was like a real, oh my God moment because Peter Gabriel is one of my favorite artists ever. And if I don't know even, well, maybe a few years later I'd have stumbled into it, but an absolute genius, But talk about the surprise of my life, because it's still one of the best concerts I've ever seen. They walked in from the back of the hall with miners' helmets on, like with a drum going, playing Biko. And it's like you're standing there and and it's that air of unexpectancy. Like if I go and see Led Zeppelin, I expect them to be brilliant. Whereas, when you go and see somebody that you're obligated to see, and it's more than a surprise. And I think the other thing with Peter Gabriel, one last thing, Brad, is what I will say, what I always try and get into these interviews is the biggest artists are always the easiest to work with because they realize it's not about them. It's about assembling a team of people around them, being good to them, having them stay with you. We talk Bowie, we talk Springsteen, same staff. U2, there's no band that has the same lineup, And even the ones who've Led Zeppelin, one of them died and that was the end of them. But most of them, Jethro Tull's have like 4,000 members, it's always just like Ian Anderson. But to keep that together with the same label, the same publishing company, the same band, the same crew, and up until Paul McGuinness retired, the same manager from 1978 right up until 2016 or whatever, 13, is, they've spent a good few hours together and grown. All right, they've been made a lot of money at the end of it, but
Yeah.
to keep that together is pretty incredible. And I think when we talk about relationships and things, you have a relationship with your audience, you have a relationship with your label, a relationship with your manager. All those things are intertwined. And if you have the ability to do that, whatever you do, I think you'll get somewhere.
That's fantastic. My second question, real quick. What's your favorite, and I'm sorry to use the American term, soccer team?
Manchester United, that's an easy one.
There you go.
We're talking about MLS, or we're talking about Premier League?
Whichever one you want. I got into soccer because my nephew was into soccer. So we started watching everything, the World Cup, the CONCACAF, you name it, the European Cup. So I started getting into watching, especially there's certain teams when they come together internationally. So when Italy and Germany plays, that isn't just Italy and Germany playing, that's history. Okay. They're pissed at each other still after 1,000 years, and I explained that to my American friends who don't understand football.
I've got an answer to that one when you're finished.
Yeah. Well, it's hilarious because they're like, well, what's the big deal? When plays an African team, that's really aggressive soccer. Somebody gets red carded within.
The thing in the English Premier League with the two, obviously Argentina aren't in the European Cup, but in the World Cup they used to be like thugs on the field. They'd go over the top tackle things. But you've got a couple of interesting points there because we now have Lionel Messi playing in the MLS.
Right.
Like, oh my God, which is far better than going to Saudi Arabia. So I'm so pleased because Ronaldo pissed me off at the end,
Oh, yeah.
His legacy should always have been there, but he was too full of his own self-importance. And the thing is, I went to see Manchester United play Benfica in 1978 with my father, and that is a moment that rocked because I remember things. But in the north of England, you support the team that your dad did, So I stayed with Manchester United. And the irony of it, I had a guy who worked with me for 12 years, and he was a Manchester City fan. And we'd always win and they'd always lose. So we had to come into work on Monday. And you have to live there to understand it because you don't want to go to work with a guy who supports the opposing local team who are doing really well and you're doing crap. Yeah. And now you look at Manchester City, and I'm just thinking, I talked to him the other week. I said, oh my God, every Monday you used to come in with your face long. And it's like anything. It's become corporate hospitality now, soccer, I think. But I watch it. I religiously, with the time difference, it's like you can sit at 7 o'clock in the morning, watch a game here, which is great. Yeah. I actually see more football matches here. The funny thing you were saying then about football was, people say to me, oh, you mean soccer? I said, no, I mean football, not football. For the ball. Oh, dear. Yeah. So I think was that the answer?
That was a good answer. I like that one.
Yeah. It'll always be Manchester United. Even when they were playing crap, I supported them.
What do you miss? And this is my final question. What do you miss most from your years of doing promotions and working with these bands? And I see the gold and silver record or platinum records on your wall behind you. What do you miss most? Well,
I've got to be serious for a moment. I've got to understand that I don't miss any of it, because people do say to me, do you miss your job? I said, well, my job doesn't exist, because I wouldn't want to come into work and download a bunch of playlists. We would make 150 phone calls on a Friday to speak to every radio station, head of music, to see if a record had gone on the playlist, if they liked it, if there was a chance of it. We would never leave the office until we wrote a report to send to the label and the management so that they knew every moment in time where they were up to with radio play and stuff and things like that. Whereas nowadays, just getting, even just when I did a radio show for 13 years in Manchester, the biggest commercial station outside of London, I used to go in and open the lock and all these records had come out. But, again, nerdy as it sounds, the touch and the feel of a piece of vinyl and pulling it out. I say to people, I lived in an age before remotes. I used to have to get up and turn a record over. Can you imagine you did what?
You did what? Yeah, I know.
But I look back very fondly on the opportunity rather than the regret that I don't have the opportunity to do it now. I mean, I'd be promoting people who were older than, like I'd be their grandfather, So
Yeah.
I kind of, I didn't so much retire as just moved into the next stage of my career. And I'm about to move away from Florida. We're going to go to Maryland. And I'm as excited now as I was when I stepped off the plane nearly 20 years ago, because I have a great opportunity to be the new kid on the block and to schmooze around and network with people and to take my story on the road and hopefully to entertain people. And that'll put food on the table and pay the rent. But it'll satisfy me in the same way that the music industry did, but just in a different way. And it's not like nostalgia is a big word. It's more kind of appreciation, I think, of I've said this to somebody the other day. I said, I wish my mother was alive to thank her for the time she gave birth to me,
Yeah.
It was different. And, by the way, you talk about the discs. I always say to people, this is the way the record industry say, hey, cop for this and don't ask us for any more money. Because if you look at them, they're not the actual records. They're the overstocks in the warehouse that they spray.
Yes.
They put your name on and they put the little British phonographic industry. But yeah, it's funny. I was kind of bullied into putting that up, but people do like it. So it's staying there.
Well, it represents your milestones. That's number one.
Well, the good thing is they've given most of them away to one CEO of a company paid $5,000 for a disc. And why anybody would want a platinum disc with my name above their fireplace?
Well, it depends on the album,
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
If you got the original, let's say, record for Purple Rain, let's say, you would hang that very proudly, I'm sure.
Yeah, that would be above the fireplace, records like. Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of really good campaigns, but also bands that even on the pop level of things, to see. The good thing that I managed to do was have something for everybody. So with Island Records, I had a lot of reggae. I had country music, with, there's country artists on BMG and stuff and things. And also like even, so that every time you went to somebody, you had something that they would like type thing. And, balancing the catalogue, so to speak.
In closing, I do really look at this next generation and I say to myself, they really missed out on, I would go to the record store and buy a bunch of albums, or I'd order from Columbia Records and Tapes, and you'd come home with that album. And this is what I remember distinctly, ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. When they did that, Mr. Blue and all this, and they had the spaceship on the outside. As an artist, I came home, I put the album on, and I just sat there and just absorbed and drank in the lyrics. I would read the lyrics and I would look at the artwork, and it was a moment. It was an event. Let's put it that way. It wasn't just, hey, let's listen to this song. It was, let's drink this in, this artist. And when CDs came out, that got smaller. And then when streaming came out, it went away. And I miss that. It's an event when you bought an album.
Oh yeah, but the thing is, I like with social media being such a vast kind of, everything kind of changes. But you look at like, and on a Saturday I would get a train like at 8:30 in the morning into the city, and I would, when the records shop that I went to, One Stop Records, would open, I'd walk in and I knew the staff, and they'd have stuff ready for me to listen to. And they had listening booths, and I would go and put my headphones on, and I would listen to at least 2 albums. So most of my day was spent in the record store, and I would go home, and I would either go to my friend's house or they would come to mine, and I couldn't wait. I would hope they hadn't bought the same record, but I couldn't wait to play them and turn it on to them. But I found it, so I had like bragging rights, But it was so great to just say, oh, you've got to hear this, man, just stick it on, and people, you sit there and, the feet are tapping, and it's just total pleasure, and then the next thing is you want to see that band live.
Yeah.
But you see, the other thing on that, Brad, was there weren't VHSs, never mind DVDs. So there wasn't computer games. There wasn't all that other stuff. It was pretty much music. If you wanted to watch a film, you went to the cinema.
Wow.
There's different levels of entertainment.
Absolutely. I'm so happy you were on today's show. Thank you for being on Awakened Nation.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Brad.
Hey, everybody, go to www.TonyMichaelides.com, and it's spelled just like it is, Tony, Michael, and then Ides, I-D-E-S, the Ides of Michael. So I'll put that in the show notes. Also, Moments That Rock, pick up the book, read the book, watch and listen to his podcast. What an amazing storyteller. And thank you once again, Tony, for being on today's show.
Thank you for having me, Brad. Much appreciated. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
You bet. Hey, everybody. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for being a big part of the Awakened Nation movement. This is how you can help me and our extraordinary guests. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please share it out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And let's grow this movement by word of mouth. Our success will be because of you. Thank you, and see you next week.